What if the very foundation of power in the antebellum South was built on a lie that began to crack, not with rebellion or war, but in the dead of night on Christmas Eve? There is a story, deliberately scrubbed from the history books, of a Mississippi plantation where silence wasn't just enforced, it was unnatural. Where three separate owners, across 3 generations, each met the same gruesome and unexplained fate, not in battle, not by revolt, but alone, in the opulent confines of their own mansions, on the one night of the year meant for peace. Why were these deaths covered up? What were the powerful so desperate to hide? The answer threatens to unravel everything we thought we knew about justice, power, and the price of silence. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. The pattern itself is the bedrock of the mystery, the inexplicable rhythm that elevates a series of tragedies into the realm of legend. It wasn't merely that the owners of Willow Creek died, it was the chilling precision of the when. The Christmas Eve curse is a label born from this relentless, repeating cadence, a date that became a character in the story, a silent annual judge. To understand the power of this pattern, one must first strip away the modern, sanitized perception of the antebellum Christmas. It was not a universal holiday of joy. For the planter class, it was a brief respite. The harvest was in, the books were closed, and it was a time for lavish entertaining, for reinforcing social bonds with other wealthy families, and for a performative, often condescending, kindness towards the enslaved populace. Extra rations of food or cloth might be distributed. Work routines were slightly relaxed. It was a calculated display of paternalism, designed to reinforce the hierarchy under a thin veneer of benevolence. For the enslaved, however, it was a complex and fraught period. The temporary easing of the brutal work regime was welcome, but it was a peace purchased under duress, a reminder of the absolute power that could be granted or withdrawn on a whim. The big house, glowing with light and music, stood as a stark monument to the immense disparity between those who owned and those who were owned. This was the backdrop against which the deaths occurred, a night of forced silence and watchful waiting for the enslaved, and of boisterous self-congratulatory celebration for the masters. Aleister Crow's death in 1810 established the template. The official story of a fall from a ladder was plausible enough to be entered into the record, yet flimsy enough to generate immediate hushed skepticism. The ladder itself feels like a prop, a piece of stage dressing designed to explain a body found on the floor. But the whispers that seeped out from the servant quarters and slave cabins told a different tale. One of a man discovered not amidst a scattered pile of books and broken wood, but in the open space of his study, his face contorted in a final mask of terror. This dissonance between the official account and the oral tradition is the first crack in the narrative. The community's willingness to accept the accident theory speaks to a desire for order, a need to believe that the world they had built operated on rational, if sometimes tragic, principles. To entertain the alternative was to acknowledge a terrifying chaos lurking just beneath the surface of their civilized society. The pattern solidified with the death of Elias Finch in 1822. 12 years later, on the same calendar date, the same outcome. Finch was a different man from Crow, less the calculating businessman, more the outright brutalizer. His death, attributed to a sudden apoplexy or stroke, was again medically convenient. A man known for his violent rages dies of a burst blood vessel. It fit a cruel poetic justice that many might have quietly appreciated. But the recurrence of the date transformed the story. One death on Christmas Eve is a tragedy. A second death on the exact same date is a coincidence that strains credulity to its breaking point. It is the point at which gossip crystallizes into lore. The term curse would have been whispered now with greater conviction, not just among the enslaved, but among the white neighbors as well. The plantation earned its moniker Silent Creek, not just for the quiet that followed the deaths, but for the silence of dread that fell over the surrounding area. It became a place apart, marked. This established pattern is what makes Julian Hawthorne's decision in 1846 an act of profound arrogance and a critical piece of the mystery. He was not ignorant of the stories. The reduced sale price of the property was a direct reflection of its macabre reputation. He knew the pattern intimately. His belief that he could break it was based on a fundamental miscalculation. He likely viewed the previous deaths through a lens of personal failing. Crow was careless, Finch was morally corrupt and paid for his sins. Hawthorne, a man of his enlightened age, believed his own firm but fair approach insulated him. He failed to comprehend that the pattern might be impersonal, a mechanism of the land or the institution itself, rather than a divine judgment on individual character. His decision to stay on that fateful Christmas Eve was a deliberate experiment, a man testing a superstition against his own modern rationality. His death was the pattern's ultimate validation. It proved the curse, or the killer, was no respecter of persons. It did not matter if the owner was ruthless, cruel, or comparatively benevolent. The status of owner itself was the qualifying condition. The third death closed the loop, transforming a strange pattern into an immutable law in the minds of all who heard the tale. It was a cycle that could not be broken, only escaped by abandoning the land entirely. The silence that followed Hawthorne's death was the final and permanent silence of a place that had proven, again and again, that it would tolerate no master. To comprehend the true horror of Willow Creek, one must first dismantle any romanticized notions of the antebellum South. This was not a world of mint juleps and gentle manners, but a brutal profit-driven engine of oppression built on the foundation of chattel slavery. The plantation was not simply a farm. It was a tightly controlled prison camp, a self-contained economic microcosm designed for a single purpose: the extraction of maximum wealth from both the land and the human beings forced to work it. The silence of Willow Creek was not peaceful. It was the silence of profound terror, of relentless surveillance, of despair so deep it could not be voiced. It was the silence imposed by the whip, the shackle, and the constant threat of sale and family separation. This oppressive quiet was the Chang Tai, the background hum of existence, against which the violent eruptions of punishment and the bizarre events of the Christmas Eve deaths played out in stark, terrifying relief. The architecture of the plantation itself was a physical manifestation of this power dynamic. The big house, with its wide verandas and grand columns, was positioned like a watchtower, offering a panoramic view of the fields and the quarters. This was not for appreciating the scenery, it was for supervision. The owner's gaze was ever present, a tangible force of control. Conversely, the slave cabins, cramped, often windowless structures of crude timber and mud, were designed for utility and surveillance, not comfort. They were usually arranged in neat rows, not for community, but for order, making it easy to see who was moving about and when. The workspace, too, was a landscape of control. The cotton fields were vast and open, offering no hiding places. The sugar mill had Willow Creek produce sugar, was a notorious site of industrial-scale brutality, with dangerous machinery and forced, relentless labor during the grinding season. Every fence, every tool, every footpath was a reminder of the absolute power of the owner and the complete subjugation of the enslaved. Within this system, the enslaved community developed a complex internal world, a culture of survival and resistance hidden in plain sight. Theirs was a silence punctuated by coded communication. Spirituals sung in the fields were not just songs of sorrow. They could be maps, carrying coded messages about escape routes or meetings. Stories told under the cover of darkness, often blending African folklore with Christian imagery, were a way to process trauma, mock their oppressors, and preserve a sense of identity and hope. The figure of the trickster, like Br'er Rabbit outsmarting stronger foes, was a beloved archetype, because it represented a victory of wit over brute force. This rich inner life was invisible to the masters, who often dismissed their captives as simple-minded or childlike, a catastrophic failure of perception that blinded them to the intelligence, resilience, and deep currents of anger that flowed just beneath the surface of enforced obedience. Christmas, therefore, existed in a state of extreme duality at Willow Creek. For the owner, it was the pinnacle of his paternalistic performance. He displayed his wealth and generosity by hosting parties and distributing gifts: extra salt pork, coarse molasses, cheap cloth. This act was a reinforcement of the hierarchy. It framed his rule as benevolent, a gift he bestowed rather than a violent system he enforced. It was a ritual designed to foster a grudging dependency and loyalty. For the enslaved, this gift was a cruel joke. They were being given a minuscule fraction of the immense wealth their years' labor had generated. The temporary break in work was necessary, not kind, a brief recovery period for the human machinery before the cycle started again. The music and laughter from the big house were not sounds of shared joy, but a stark auditory reminder of their own exclusion and bondage. The silence in the quarters during these celebrations was heavy, complex, and charged. It was a silence that could contain grief for lost loved ones, simmering resentment, and perhaps, for some, the cold, quiet focus of a long-awaited plan. It is within this oppressive, dualistic reality that the Christmas Eve deaths must be contextualized. The master's house on that night was at its most isolated. The surrounding white community was engrossed in its own celebrations. The overseer might be drunk or absent. The normal rhythms of work and surveillance were suspended. This created a unique window of opportunity, a moment of heightened vulnerability for the man at the top. The silence of the plantation, usually a tool of his control, could become a weapon against him. Every creak of the floorboards, every moan of the wind outside, every sound from the darkened quarters would have taken on a new, ominous significance. The very performance of power, sitting alone in his study, surrounded by the ledgers that documented his dominion, became an act of profound isolation. He was a king on a throne in a suddenly empty castle, surrounded by the silent, watchful eyes of the very people he had spent a lifetime subjugating. The Silent Plantation on Christmas Eve was thus a perfect storm, a moment of symbolic power for the owner and a moment of unique tactical advantage for anyone who sought to challenge that power. The silence wasn't just a setting for the mystery, it was an active ingredient, a palpable force that shaped the events, heightening the fear of the master and potentially providing the perfect cover for an act of retribution that would, itself, be swallowed by the silence, leaving behind only an unshakable legend and a terror that finally forced the masters to abandon their throne. The story of Willow Creek begins not with a ghost, but with a deed of land. In 1799, the Mississippi Territory was a raw and violent frontier, a place where fortunes were carved from the wilderness with sheer will and ruthless ambition. Into this world came Alistair Crowe, a Scotsman whose character seemed forged from the same hard materials as the frontier itself. He was not a planter by birth or tradition. He was a businessman, an opportunist with a cold eye for potential, and a ledger book where he quantified the world. His acquisition of the land that would become Willow Creek was a calculated transaction, the first entry in a financial project he intended to master. Crowe's genius, and his defining characteristic, was his utter dispassion. He viewed the immense challenge of clearing the land, draining the swamps, and planting the first crops not as a struggle against nature, but as a complex logistical problem to be solved. His ledgers, fragments of which survived in family papers, are chilling in their clarity and absence of emotion. They detail the cost of tools, the price of seed, and the investment in human capital. Enslaved men, women, and children are listed, alongside livestock and equipment, their value assessed, their depreciation noted, their lives reduced to an asset column. For Crowe, they were not people, they were units of labor, an equation where input of food and shelter was meticulously balanced against output of cotton bales. There is no record of cruelty for its own sake. That would be an inefficiency, a pointless expenditure of energy. But there is also no record of kindness, no acknowledgement of humanity. His was a tyranny of pure, unadulterated arithmetic. He built his empire with this relentless logic. The main house was not a monument to taste or gentility, but to solidity and function. The fields were laid out for maximum efficiency, not aesthetic pleasure. His rule was predictable, harsh, and impersonal. A worker who failed to meet their quota was punished not out of anger, but as a necessary correction to a production error, much like repairing a broken plow. This calculated approach made Willow Creek remarkably profitable within a decade. Crowe's power was absolute. derived from law and reinforced by the isolated, self-contained world he had created. He was the undisputed master of a small kingdom, answerable to no one, his authority as seemingly permanent and unassailable as the house he had built. This is what makes his death on Christmas Eve 1810 so profoundly disruptive. The official story, that he fell from a ladder while reaching for a bottle of port, feels like a narrative desperately crafted to fit a reality that made no sense. It is a small, almost foolish death, entirely out of keeping with the character of the man. Alistair Crowe, a man who calculated every risk, succumbing to a clumsy accident. It doesn't align. The alternative accounts, the ones that seeped out from the servants and passed into whispered legend, carry a more terrifying truth. They say he was found not by a toppled ladder, but in the center of his study, as if he had been standing there, when something stopped his heart. They speak of a face frozen in a rictus of terror, a look so alien to the man's cold, composed nature that it was more shocking than the death itself. This first death established the essential paradox of the Willow Creek curse. The official record needed a rational, mundane explanation to preserve the illusion of a rational, controllable world, a world where masters did not die of fear in their own studies. The community, though perhaps harboring private doubts, had to publicly accept this explanation. To do otherwise was to question the very foundation of their society, the inherent right and security of the master class. Yet, beneath this public acceptance, the unofficial story took root. It was a story that spoke to a deep, subconscious understanding that Crowe's form of power, for all its calculated efficiency, was ultimately brittle. It could not account for everything. It could not quantify fear. It could not ledger away horror. His death, in its mysterious and terrifying form, was the first crack in the edifice. It was the moment the cold, hard arithmetic of his world failed, and something older, darker, and utterly incalculable was entered into the books. The founding owner, the man who believed he could reduce life to numbers, was ultimately killed by a variable he never saw coming. The death of Alistair Crowe could be filed away as a bizarre tragedy, a single note of discord in the orderly symphony of plantation life, but a pattern requires repetition. The second chapter of the Willow Creek story arrived 12 years later, in the form of Elias Finch, a nephew who inherited not just the land and the ledger books, but the absolute power that came with them. Where Crowe was cold and calculating, Finch was fire and brutality. He was the dark inverse of his uncle, proof that the system of chattel slavery could accommodate both the dispassionate businessman and the outright sadist, and both could thrive. Finch's reign was marked by a different kind of record. While Crowe's ledgers noted quotas and yields, Finch's name began to appear in the sparse county court documents, not as a plaintiff in a business dispute, but as a defendant in cases of excessive correction. These were rare, as the law offered enslaved people almost no protection, and charges were only brought in the most extreme and publicly visible cases. The fact that Finch attracted this kind of attention speaks volumes. He was a man governed by impulse and rage, for whom violence was not a managerial tool but an expression of his own dominion. The whip was not a last resort. It was his language. The stories that survived, passed down not in official documents, but in the oral history of the region, tell of a man who found a perverse pleasure in the exercise of his power, who believed that fear was a more effective motivator than the cold economic incentive Crowe had relied upon. This shift in management style changed the very atmosphere of Willow Creek. Under Crowe, the silence was that of the efficient machine, a grim predictability. Under Finch, the silence was that of a beaten animal, tense and waiting for the next blow. The oppression became personal, capricious, and intimately cruel. Where Crowe might punish a shortfall in pounds of cotton, Finch might punish a look, a tone, a perceived slight. His ownership was felt not just in the fields, but in the very air of the cabins, a constant looming threat that made the Silent Plantation moniker take on a new, more dreadful meaning. His death on Christmas Eve 1822, therefore, invited a very different interpretation than Crowe's. The official cause, a sudden apoplexy or stroke, was again medically convenient. A man known for his volcanic temper dies of a burst blood vessel. It felt like a moral conclusion, a narrative of divine retribution that the community could understand and accept. It fit a simplistic cosmic justice, the cruel master struck down by his own inner fury. This explanation was psychologically comforting. It contained the horror, framing it as a lesson about the dangers of individual sin rather than a flaw in the system itself. It was easier to believe God had punished a wicked man than to entertain the notion that the very position of master might be inherently cursed or vulnerable. But the repetition of the date whispered a more terrifying truth. The stroke theory explained the how, but it utterly failed to explain the when. Why did the stroke occur on December 24th? Why did it strike down Alistair Crowe, a man not known for passionate anger, and then Elias Finch, a man defined by it, on the exact same night of the year? The coincidence was too glaring, too precise to be ignored. This is where the legend truly began to crystallize. The story was no longer about two separate, unrelated deaths. It was now a sequence, a pattern. The curse was no longer a whispered suspicion. It became a framework for understanding events that logic could not contain. The community was caught in a difficult position. The divine retribution theory was the safest, most socially acceptable way to process Finch's death. It allowed them to condemn the man while still upholding the institution he represented. They could cast Finch as a bad apple, an outlier whose personal failings brought about his demise, thus protecting the system from scrutiny. Yet, the nagging coincidence of the date introduced a seed of doubt that this was God's work. Divine. Punishment would not be so mechanically tied to a calendar. The unwavering rhythm suggested something else, something more ancient, more impersonal, and far more methodical. It hinted at a force that was not judging the character of the owner, but merely ticking off the years, waiting for the next occupant of the big house to claim their title and, in doing so, make themselves a target. The second death transformed Willow Creek from a place of tragedy into a place of destiny. It was no longer a question of if the master would die, but a matter of waiting for the next Christmas Eve to see how. The pattern was now set in stone, a grim piece of local lore that hung over Willow Creek like the Spanish moss on its oaks. Two masters, two deaths, both on the night of December 24th. The plantation stood for over 2 decades as a monument to this mystery, a place shunned by respectable society, its reputation as a cursed land solidifying with each passing year. It became a story used to chasten children or a topic for hushed conversation on neighboring porches, a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the price of cruelty. The land, once so valuable, was now toxic, its value measured in superstition and fear rather than cotton yields. Then, in 1844, came Julian Hawthorne. He was an outsider, a man of means from Philadelphia, drawn south by the economic opportunity that followed the Panic of 1837. He was a rationalist, a man of the modern age, steeped in the burgeoning industrial and scientific optimism of the mid-19th century. To him, the stories of Willow Creek were not warnings. They were the primitive superstitions of a backward rural society. He saw not a curse, but a spectacular bargain. He was a businessman, and he believed the plantation's macabre history had artificially depressed its price, presenting him with a chance to acquire a prime asset for a fraction of its worth. His arrogance was not of the cruel, personal sort, exhibited by Elias Finch, but the arrogance of enlightenment, a firm belief that reason could triumph over folklore. Hawthorne's strategy was one of systematic sanitization. He embarked on a campaign to modernize and exercise the past through progress. He renovated the main house not to make it a grander symbol of power, but to make it brighter, airier, a testament to comfortable modern living. He cleared more land, invested in newer equipment, and sought to run the plantation with what he considered a firm but fair managerial style. This was a calculated performance of enlightened ownership. He believed the previous tragedies were the result of flawed management. Crowe's cold neglect and Finch's outright barbarism had, in his view, fostered an environment of resentment and carelessness that led to their downfalls. He was convinced that his own benevolence, his modern approach, would act as a shield. He was not just buying land. He was attempting to disprove a myth. This belief is what makes his actions in December of 1846 the critical, culminating act of the entire story. As Christmas Eve approached, the usual whispers in the region began again, now tinged with a morbid curiosity. The new northern owner had lasted 2 years. The pattern was due to repeat. Hawthorne was acutely aware of this. Scrutiny. To leave, to send his family away and retreat, would be to admit a belief in the very superstition he had publicly mocked. It would be a surrender of his rationality to the forces of ignorance. His decision to stay was, therefore, an act of sheer defiance. It was a deliberate, conscious test of the legend. He would sit in the house alone and prove its fundamental emptiness by simply waking up on Christmas morning. His preparations reveal a man grappling with a fear he would never admit to possessing. Sending his family away was framed as a precaution for their comfort and safety. But it was also a clearing of the stage. He was isolating the variable. He would be the sole subject of this experiment. The small supper he hosted was likely a tense, awkward affair, filled with forced conversation and nervous glances from the staff, who understood the weight of the night far better than he did. When he retired to his study, he was stepping into the role, sitting in the same symbolic seat of power that Crow and Finch had occupied on their final nights. He was surrounded by the trappings of his modern rationality, his books, his ledgers, his well-ordered thoughts, believing them to be a sufficient defense against the amorphous threat of a story. His death was the ultimate contradiction of his worldview. The man who believed he could manage superstition was found by it, defeated not by a specter or a poison, but by the sheer, undeniable power of the pattern itself. The terror etched on his face was the final, silent scream of reason, confronting something it could not quantify, could not explain, and could not control. Hawthorne's demise proved the most terrifying truth of all. The curse, or the killer, was utterly impersonal. It did not care about his modern methods, his comparative benevolence, or his northern pragmatism. It only recognized the title he held. By claiming ownership of Willow Creek, he had, in the eyes of whatever force governed its dark history, signed his own name into the ledger and accepted its terms. His death was not a judgment on his character, but a cold, mechanical fulfillment of a contract written long before he ever arrived. The 3 deaths at Willow Creek present a puzzle with pieces that refuse to fit neatly together, forcing any serious inquiry to confront a range of possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. The central mystery is not merely the fact of the deaths, but their specific repeating circumstances, the solitude of the victim, the absence of clear violence, and the unwavering anchor of the date. Unraveling this requires examining the evidence through different lenses: the rational, the historical, the cultural, and the deeply unnerving realm of the unknown. The most logical, and for many, the most comforting explanation is that of a coordinated act of resistance. This theory posits that the enslaved community at Willow Creek, spanning generations, engineered a flawless campaign of retribution. The methodology is the first question. A slow, cumulative poison derived from plants like water hemlock or Jimson weed, knowledge of which was preserved from African traditions or learned from native communities, is a strong candidate. Administered in small, untraceable doses over time, it could culminate in a fatal crisis on a predetermined night. The Christmas Eve timing was strategically brilliant. The holiday provided the perfect cover. The master was isolated, often drinking heavily, which could mask the taste of a toxin and explain sudden illness. The general air of celebration and disruption of routine provided anonymity for the perpetrator. This theory transforms the story from a supernatural curse into one of immense courage, intelligence, and patience. A long war fought in absolute secrecy. Yet the poison theory faces challenges. Could the same method, or even the same family, line of poisoners, persist undetected across 3 owners and nearly 4 decades? Would the symptoms of 3 different poisons, or even the same one, be consistently misdiagnosed as a fall, apoplexy, and mysterious causes by different doctors? This leads to a darker, more psychological possibility: the power of suggestion weaponized. What if the first death was indeed a natural, if bizarre, accident. The legend that grew from it became a cultural artifact, a story told in the quarters that empowered the enslaved and terrified the masters. Elias Finch, a man prone to violent rages, living in the shadow of this story, could have genuinely suffered a stroke brought on by the stress of his own temperament and the pervasive fear of the date. Julian Hawthorne, the rationalist determined to prove the story false, may have been the most vulnerable of all. The psychological weight of his experiment, the absolute silence of the house, the anticipation of a threat he didn't believe in but could not ignore, could this alone have induced a catastrophic panic attack, a psychic break so severe it stopped his heart? In this theory, the curse was a psychological weapon so powerful it became real, killing the last two masters through the sheer force of their own fear, a fear cultivated and nurtured by the oppressed. Beyond human agency lies the possibility of something older and more implacable. Folklore from West African traditions, which many of the enslaved would have carried with them, speaks of the land itself holding spiritual energy. The concept of a hungry or wronged place that demands balance is a recurring theme. The immense suffering and blood spilled on the land at Willow Creek, the backbreaking labor, the violence of the lash, the spiritual death of bondage, could have, in this worldview, created a spiritual poison that saturated the soil. The plantation house, built on this foundation of suffering, became a focal point for this energy. The master, the literal and symbolic beneficiary of this system, became the target for this need for rebalancing. The curse, then, was not an active spell cast by people, but a passive environmental force, a spiritual toxicity that reached a fatal concentration on the symbolic night of the master's greatest performance of power. Christmas Eve. The date is key, not as a choice of the enslaved, but as a point of cosmic irony. The night meant for peace and birth became the night of retribution and death. Finally, there is the possibility that these explanations are not mutually exclusive. Perhaps the truth is a terrifying synergy of all three. A natural accident begets a powerful story. That story empowers the enslaved to act, perhaps using a subtle poison on Finch. The confirmed pattern of two deaths then becomes a psychological weapon of immense power, making Hawthorne, a man already isolated by his rationality, the perfect victim for a death born of sheer terror. The curse would thus be a living thing, a feedback loop of history, action, and belief. It began with a real event, was nurtured by human resistance, and was completed by the psychological architecture of the very system of oppression it destroyed. The genius of the mystery is that each theory fits the known facts, yet each leaves a lingering question, a piece of the puzzle, that remains just out of sight, ensuring that the silence of Willow Creek remains, forever, unbroken. The final, and perhaps most profound, layer of the Willow Creek mystery is not the how or the why of the deaths, but the systematic and deliberate effort to ensure they were forgotten. The Silent Plantation earned its name not just from the quiet that followed the events, but from the wall of silence that was constructed around them. This was not a passive forgetting. It was an active, conscious process of erasure, a necessary act of preservation for a society that could not afford the truth. To understand this, one must first grasp the monumental threat the Willow Creek story posed to the antebellum South. The entire social and economic order was built upon a foundational myth, the righteousness and invulnerability of the planter class. They were depicted as benevolent patriarchs, civilized men bringing order and Christianity to a savage land and a primitive people. Their authority was presented as natural, God-given, and absolute. The events at Willow Creek shattered this mythology. It suggested vulnerability. It hinted that the master, in his own home, on the most symbolic night of the year, was not safe. This was an idea so dangerous it was literally unspeakable. If it could happen at Willow Creek, it could happen anywhere. It could foster ideas of resistance. It could shatter the aura of invincibility that was crucial to maintaining control, and it could provide a blueprint for Tiaojan. The official responses to each death are masterclasses in narrative control. Alistair Crow's accident and Elias Finch's apoplexy were not just diagnoses, they were political acts. They were the authorized stories, the ones entered into the court records and the local newspapers. They were designed to be bland, explainable, and most importantly, devoid of pattern. A fall and a stroke are random tragedies. They do not connect to form a larger, more terrifying picture. The community's quick acceptance of these tales was a form of collective self-defense. To question the official story was to invite a panic that could destabilize the entire region. It was far safer to believe in two unrelated misfortunes than to entertain the notion of a coordinated attack or an unnatural force targeting the very pinnacle of their social structure. The death of Julian Hawthorne in 1846 broke this strategy. A third death on the same date could not be explained away with a convenient medical term. The inquest's verdict of death by mysterious causes was a confession of failure. It was a legal placeholder, a phrase that admitted confusion while simultaneously shutting down further inquiry. It was the equivalent of drawing a black box around the event and declaring it off limits. This was the point where active suppression began. The story was too potent to be allowed to circulate freely. It would have been discussed in hushed tones, but it would have been discouraged, dismissed as foolish superstition by the local gentry and authorities. Records, diary entries, personal letters that might have speculated too freely would have been lost or destroyed. Families connected to the events would have encouraged amnesia, steering conversation away from the topic to protect their own reputations and the sanctity of their class. The abandonment of Willow Creek was the ultimate act of silencing. By walking away from a valuable property, the community was making a powerful statement. They were conceding that the land was beyond reclamation, not because the soil was poor, but because the story was too powerful to overcome. Letting the plantation be consumed by the wilderness was a way to bury the evidence. Rotting timbers and collapsing walls tell no stories. They create a physical void where a historical one already existed. It was a quarantine of memory. The land itself was ostracized, made untouchable, ensuring that no fourth act would be added to the story, and that no one would be tempted to investigate further. This silencing, however, was never complete. It could not reach the quarters. The official story was for the courthouse and the newspaper. The true story, in all its variations, the tales of poison, of terror, of a land claiming its due, was preserved in the oral traditions of the enslaved and their descendants. It became a hidden transcript, a narrative of resistance and cosmic justice shared out of earshot of the powerful. The white community might have forced the story into the shadows, but they could not kill it. In fact, their efforts to suppress it only added to its power, confirming its dangerous truth. The legacy of this silence is a historical wound. It represents the countless stories of resistance, tragedy, and mystery that were systematically erased from the official record to maintain a facade of control. Willow Creek stands as a ghost in the historical machine, a reminder that the past is not always what was written down, but what was whispered in the spaces between the words, waiting, like the land itself, for someone to finally listen. The silence of Willow Creek was not an absence of sound, but a deliberate act of erasure. A story too dangerous to be told was buried, not in the earth, but in the ledgers of official history. But some truths refuse to stay buried. They whisper in the rustle of the Spanish moss and linger in the crumbling ruins of a forgotten past. What do you believe happened on those 3 Christmas Eves? Was it a flawless act of resistance, a terrifying supernatural force, or something else entirely? The mystery remains, and your voice is part of unraveling it. Subscribe to our channel and join our community of history detectives. Dive deeper into the forgotten chapters of the past, where the stories are dark, the truths are complex, and the shadows hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. Comment below and tell us your theory. Do you side with the historians, the folklorists, or do you have a unique perspective all your own? The conversation starts with you. Don't forget to like and share to keep the investigation going.